In this video, I will answer the question, what are the multifaceted impacts of oil pipelines on Indigenous communities? Oil pipelines are being constructed to satisfy the growing oil market. Many of these pipelines pass through Indigenous land. To answer this question, I will use the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion as my example. This pipeline goes through an area called Pipsel, one of the few remaining sacred sites of the Semwepik Nation, as well as more than 120 Indigenous communities along the route of the pipeline. Many communities strongly oppose the pipeline as it could leak in their water. However, some groups also support the pipeline expansion as it could bring prosperity to their reserves. According to the National Library of Medicine, pipelines can contaminate traditional food sources and drinkable water. An example of this is the Tsleil-Waututh Nation, or TWN for short. Federal monitoring and TWN documentation have shown increased shellfish biotoxin levels in TWN's traditional territory near the terminus where the Trans Mountain Pipeline pipes crude oil. Much of the land that pipelines are being built on is unceded territory. The government has ignored the legality concerns of doing construction on land that isn't theirs, and that they had not been permitted to go on. Specialists in Crown Indigenous Relations states it's their territory and their law, so it should really trump Canadian law in that context. Indigenous people have voiced their opinions in protests and letters to the government. However, they have yet to have much success. This shows that there is still a long, winding road before Indigenous people in Canada can feel fully accepted and be treated equally.
People have not given consent in the area. It's one of the largest nations in the interior of British Columbia. The land is still held under collective title of our Secwepemc people.
On the other hand, there's still a large group of Indigenous people supporting pipeline construction. Aboriginal communities have few employment and income opportunities due to their distance from major urban centers. Research by the Canadian Energy Centre reports that 4 First Nation communities in the heart of the Alberta oil sands all have shown less reliance on government transfers, lower unemployment, and higher incomes. Trans Mountain has signed 66 agreements with 73 Indigenous groups in Alberta and British Columbia. That represents more than $550 million in benefits and opportunities for Indigenous communities. Indigenous communities often depend on government transfers to fund reserves. A pipeline can provide them with a stable source of income so that they no longer rely on government funding. This can lead them to self-government. Chief de Bornay says, "We want to be able to provide for our people. I don't want Ottawa providing for our people."
Our communities utilize this resource of oil and gas to help subsidize the lack of federal funding that we receive under the Indian Act. Our First Nations to look at possibly owning the pipeline.
What are the multifaceted impacts of oil pipelines on Indigenous communities? With the construction of the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion, many Indigenous people in Canada felt powerless that their protests and complaints were ignored. There is a fear of irreversible damage to their environment and land. Currently, the pipeline is owned by the federal government. Indigenous people are discussing ownership, but there's a slim chance that Canada will sell the pipeline to them. Selling the pipeline to Indigenous is the only way to resolve that lingering conflict. With the current situation, more people will move into reserves, as they will be employed and supported by their communities. The people and environment around the pipeline would suffer, losing much of the physical form of their culture, traditional foods, endangered species, sacred lands, prayer sites, and much more that had already been damaged in prior pipeline construction. The Canadian government will have to make amends with the many Indigenous communities that had not agreed to the pipeline and come to an agreement of partial or full Indigenous ownership of the pipeline.
The mass majority of Indigenous people are supporting this. We all look at it from an economic standpoint. It's going to change the opportunity for us that now exists where we have 70-80% unemployment in our communities, and it's going to have a definite economic spin which will give opportunities.
Distinguishing our rights and our title to our territories, and that's what these agreements with Kinder Morgan do. It does extinguish our rights and our title to our lands, and gives a little cash incentive and says there's jobs, but talking to the Chiam members, there is no job.
Thank you for listening to my presentation.